AITA for ruining Mother's Day after my mom sent me a $347,000 invoice. Hi, my name is Claire. I'm 28 years old. I live in a small apartment in a city I love. I work a job I fought hard for, and finally I feel like I have control over my life. It hasn't always been this way. Growing up, I was the girl who never seemed to be enough. I wasn't smart enough, pretty enough, or ambitious enough, at least according to my mother. I spent years trying to please her, chasing impossible standards that shifted weekly, until I learned the hard truth. I could never win in her eyes. But I thought I was past it. I had moved on, or so I believed. I was building a life of my own, surrounded by people who celebrated my successes instead of mocking my mistakes. And then on a random Thursday morning, it all came crashing down in the most absurd and humiliating way imaginable. I had just finished my morning coffee when the mail arrived. I usually toss the junk mail into the recycling bin, but one envelope caught my eye. It was heavier than usual, formal-looking, with my mother's handwriting on the front. There was something unsettling about how official it looked, like a legal notice or a hospital bill. My heart skipped a beat, a little warning sign I should have listened to. Curiosity, and maybe a touch of dread, made me open it. And there it was. A neatly typed sheet of paper with a title that made my stomach turn. $347,000. The cost of raising a failure. I stared at the numbers, convinced I was hallucinating. An invoice from my mother for my life. I read the title again and again. My eyes scanned the page, and that's when the itemized charges hit me like a punch to the gut. There were detailed expenses for every misstep she had ever criticized me for. Missed deadlines, failed relationships, wasted college tuition, broken promises, and even the emotional distress she claimed I caused her by not living up to her expectations. First I laughed. I mean, it had to be a joke, right? Who does this? But the laughter died in my throat when I recognized her handwriting at the bottom of the signature line. My mother had billed me for living my life. I sat down, gripping the edge of the kitchen island to anchor myself to reality. My first instinct was disbelief, quickly followed by a tidal wave of anger and humiliation. I felt like a character in someone else's nightmare, one of those twisted stories where a parent punishes their child for daring to exist. Every word on that page felt like a blow, not just to my stomach but to my self-worth, my independence, everything I had worked so hard to build. I thought about calling my friends, but they might not even grasp the sheer depth of the absurdity and cruelty. Who could? You hear about toxic parents? Sure. But being labeled a failure with a $347,000 price tag was on another level entirely. My hand trembled as I held the paper. Was this a warped attempt at humor, as she would later claim, a lesson, or just pure malice disguised as accounting? I remember sitting there for what felt like hours, staring at the numbers, imagining them branded on my chest. I wanted to rip it up, burn it, flush it down the toilet, but I couldn't. There was something about keeping it, holding it, looking at it, that felt important, like saving a piece of evidence from the most ridiculous thing I had ever been subjected to. And then, almost in a whisper to myself, I realized something. I couldn't let this go, not because I wanted to argue the math, but because I couldn't let her rewrite my life into a ledger of failures. A spark ignited somewhere deep inside me. This wasn't just an invoice, it was a challenge. And I wasn't going to let it define me. I looked back at the envelope and made a promise to myself. I hadn't made a promise to anyone in years. I wasn't going to break down. I was going to fight back. I wish I could say the $347,000 bill came as a complete shock. In reality, it was just the latest and most ridiculous chapter in a story that began long before I could speak clearly. My childhood wasn't just difficult. It was a constant treadmill of criticism and disappointment, orchestrated by my mother. She had this gift for turning anything I did into a failure. A good grade? You only got that because the test was easy. A drawing I made? Your cousin could have done better at your age. A compliment from a teacher? They're just being polite. Nothing was ever enough. My father, on the other hand, well, he existed. He was quiet, often avoiding conflict, nodding along as my mother picked me apart. He seemed to believe that as long as he didn't intervene, nothing truly catastrophic was happening. He didn't see, or maybe didn't want to see, how her words were carving away at me. And my grandmother, who was supposed to be my refuge, my source of comfort, the one to defend me, had her own way of chipping away at me too. Not with loud, open criticism, but with cold, cutting remarks that lingered longer than my mother's shouting. She's always been a bit of a letdown, my grandmother would murmur when my mother wasn't around, as if confirming my guilt even in her absence. I remember my 8th birthday like it was yesterday. I had begged for a simple party, just a few friends from my class and some cake from the grocery store. Instead, my mother criticized every detail. The balloons were the wrong color. My dress was too flashy. My friends weren't interesting enough. By the end of the day, I had learned a valuable lesson. Even on your birthday, you can be measured and found lacking. And somehow it was all my fault. School offered no relief. I was careful, studious, and desperately tried to prove my worth. I joined clubs, volunteered, and got good grades, but every achievement was met with either indifference or an explanation of how I could have done better. "You only got that award because no one else tried for it," she once said, and I believed her. Every failure she claimed I had became internalized, seared into my identity. As a teenager, I became afraid to even try new things. It wasn't that I didn't want to succeed. It was that I had learned success didn't matter in the eyes of the people whose opinion should have mattered most. And then there was my grandmother. People saw her as sweet and doting, but I knew the other side. She could be cruel without ever raising her voice. One afternoon I came home from school, proudly holding a high score on a difficult exam. My grandmother glanced at it, smiled faintly and said, "Good. Let's just hope the next one isn't a fluke." That small comment lodged itself in my mind, festering. Even when my mother wasn't criticizing me, someone else in my family was there to remind me I wasn't enough. I spent years trying to please them both, walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate what words or actions might elicit a smile, a nod of approval, or a rare compliment. I became hyper-aware of every mistake, every imperfect smile, internalizing their judgment until it became a second skin. I tried to escape by doing everything right in school, socially, and even professionally later on. But no matter what I achieved, I never felt free. I was always bracing for the next critique, the next blow disguised as guidance. And now, the $347,000 invoice. It landed on my desk like the physical embodiment of everything I had been running from my entire life. It wasn't just numbers on a page. It was the crystallization of years of insults, manipulation, and emotional abuse. I suddenly realized this invoice was my mother's ultimate proof that I had failed in her eyes. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let it define me. I wasn't 8 years old anymore. I wasn't powerless. That piece of paper, as absurd as it was, became a challenge I could accept, not as a failure, but as the beginning of my fight. And deep down, a small dangerous spark ignited, the idea that maybe, just maybe, I could send all that toxicity right back to them. I stared at that $347,000 invoice for what felt like hours. I could barely process it. My mother had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just the absurdity of the figure. It was the way she had itemized every failure in my life. It was the underlying message, that my existence, my mistakes, and even my triumphs were all subject to her judgment, that I had somehow cost her money, time, and emotional energy simply by being me. I finally picked up the phone and dialed her number. My hands were shaking as I heard it ring. I wanted answers. I wanted her to explain why she would send me a bill for living my life. But mostly I wanted to feel human again, to hear her say just once that she was proud of me. "Hello." Her voice was crisp, controlled, almost cheerful. "Mom," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "We need to talk about this. This invoice you sent me." There was a pause, a quiet, calculated beat. "Oh, that," she said finally, as if she had just brought in the wrong mail. "It's a lesson, Claire. A little dose of reality. You need to understand the cost of your decisions." I blinked. I couldn't even process the words. A lesson? She had sent me a $347,000 bill labeled, "The cost of raising a failure." And now she was acting as if it were some kind of educational exercise. "Seriously?" I asked, my voice rising. "This isn't a joke. You sent me a bill for living my life, for being your daughter." She laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh or even a sarcastic one. It was a light, dismissive chuckle that made my blood run cold. "Oh, Claire, you always take things so seriously. It's just numbers. A bit of fun." A reminder. You need to understand responsibility. You're 28 years old and still making the same mistakes you did when you were 12. It's time to face reality. I could feel my face burning with a mixture of rage and shame. Her words weren't just absurd. They were sharp, cruel, and calculating. Suddenly, every ounce of self-worth I had built over the years felt threatened, as if it could be erased by the very person who was supposed to protect me. I can't believe this, I whispered more to myself than to her. I can't believe this is coming from you, from my own mother. Well, she said, the amusement in her voice now undeniable. Believe it. You owe me something, Claire. You've cost me everything. It's time you acknowledged it. I slammed the phone down. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to do a million things, but mostly I just sat there trembling, staring at the invoice on my table. My mother had turned my life into an accounting ledger, and now she expected me to feel guilty. I called my best friend, Alyssa. I had to tell someone. I needed validation. Someone to say, no, you're not crazy. No, this isn't normal. You're kidding me, Alyssa said when I read parts of the bill to her. Claire, that's insane. That's probably illegal in some states. I know, I said, my voice cracking. I just don't even know how to deal with this. I feel humiliated and angry and sick to my stomach, and I don't know whether to laugh or cry. You are definitely not paying it, she said firmly. And honestly, you need to start thinking about how to protect yourself from her, because this isn't a one-time thing. She's trying to control you through guilt. Her words hit me like a lightning bolt. Control. That's what this was really about. Not a lesson. Not a joke. My mother had always tried to shape my life, to dictate my choices, and now, even at 28, she was trying to do the same thing through financial intimidation. A strange clarity washed over me. For the first time, I understood something crucial. I didn't have to play her game. I didn't have to accept her narrative that I was a failure. I didn't have to let her control my emotions or my life anymore. But one thing was also clear. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend it didn't happen. Something had to be done. And deep down, beneath the hurt and humiliation, a spark ignited something I had been suppressing for years. If she wanted to treat me like a failure, maybe it was time to show her exactly who held the power in this story. After the call with my mother, I was shaking. My hands still felt numb. My chest was heavy with anger and disbelief. I needed anyone to understand, to tell me I wasn't crazy, to tell me I wasn't a failure. The first person who came to mind was my grandmother. She had always been the one person I thought might see the good in me, even when my mother couldn't. I dialed her number, my heart pounding. I pictured her calming voice, the warmth of her presence, the comforting reassurance I clung to as a child. Maybe she would scold my mother. Maybe she would say something comforting. I held on to the hope that she would remind me that I was worthy, that I was enough, regardless of my mother's relentless judgment. Grandma. My voice sounded weak, fragile even to me. Claire, she said, her voice calm, too calm. Is something wrong? I took a shaky breath. It's Mom. She sent me a bill, a real invoice, Grandma, for $347,000. She called it the cost of raising a failure, and I just let the words hang there. I wanted to scream, I wanted to cry. I wanted someone to tell me it wasn't true. There was a pause, and then, instead of comfort, came a soft, almost regretful sigh. Claire, maybe she has a point. I froze. What do you mean, Grandma? How can you say that? Are you on her side? I'm not on her side, dear, she said, her voice almost clinical. But you have to admit, you could have done better in certain areas. We've all seen it. My stomach churned. A wave of betrayal hit me harder than any of my mother's words ever had. I had expected at least a little support, a hint of empathy, but instead, the person I had trusted most after my mother had just validated the cruelty. My grandmother, the one who had held me as a child when I cried at night, who once told me I was smart and capable, was now telling me I had failed. I don't understand, I whispered, a lump forming in my throat. I just wanted someone to believe in me, just a little. She sighed again, this time more forcefully, as if weighing her words. Claire, life is hard. People are hard. You can't expect everyone to celebrate you all the time. Maybe this is the wake-up call you need. I felt something inside me break, and yet, in that brokenness, a new sense of clarity began to form. It was as if a door had slammed shut, but another had creaked open. I realized then that the toxicity in my family wasn't going away. My mother and grandmother were who they were, and they weren't going to change. The anger that had been simmering for years now boiled over. I wasn't just angry at my mother anymore. I was angry at the whole system that had taught me I was never enough, at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally only to consistently remind me of my flaws. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling, and stared at the wall. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I could feel the weight of decades of criticism on me, and yet I also felt a spark of something dangerous, something powerful. If they wanted to brand me a failure, if they wanted to control my life through shame and guilt, then I realized something crucial. I didn't have to let them. I didn't have to break down. I didn't have to apologize for existing. And maybe, just maybe, I could turn this entire nightmare into something I could control for once. I could feel a plan developing, not impulsive, not reckless, but careful, deliberate. And just enough to remind my mother and grandmother that I was not, and never had been, their failure. They had underestimated me for decades, and they were about to learn exactly what that meant. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them define my story anymore. And if they wanted to wage a war through guilt and humiliation, I was ready to fight back. That day, sitting alone in my small apartment, I promised myself I would reclaim my life, my dignity, and my power. And when I was done, they would finally see me not as a failure, but as someone they could never control again. After my grandmother's devastating response, I felt a storm of emotions. Rage, betrayal, and disbelief. But deep down, a spark of determination began to burn. For the first time in years, I realized that if I didn't take control of the situation, it would continue to define me. My mother's $347,000 invoice wasn't just absurd. It was a declaration of war. And suddenly, I understood that I had to respond, but lashing out with careless recklessness would accomplish nothing. I had to plan, strategize, and reclaim my power in a way they would never anticipate. I started by documenting everything. Not just the invoice, not just the insults, but decades of patterns. Every backhanded compliment, every sarcastic remark, every subtle humiliation. I opened a folder on my laptop and began to write. There were moments from my childhood. My 8th birthday party ruined by criticism. The time my mother told me my report card was disappointing despite all A's. My grandmother's ambiguous comments that made me feel guilty for even being happy. I also included things from my adult life. The times my mother had tried to manipulate me through guilt over my career choices, personal relationships, or financial decisions. Seeing it all collected in one place sent a chill down my spine. It was long, exhausting, and emotionally draining, but it was also strangely empowering. Next, I consulted with trusted friends and mentors. I carefully selected people with backgrounds in legal matters or family disputes. I didn't want to go in blind. I wanted to understand my rights, what boundaries I could set, and how to protect myself while remaining calm and composed. One lawyer friend gently reminded me, "Claire, you don't have to accept their definition of failure. And remember, there are ways to assert yourself legally and emotionally without stooping to their level of anger." Those words resonated deeply. I understood that revenge didn't have to be reckless, could be smart, strategic, and satisfying. I also spent time reflecting on my own life. I had achieved things despite the constant criticism and lack of support. I reminded myself that I was living independently, paying my own bills, building a career, and forging healthy, supportive relationships. I had survived their emotional games and I had thrived. And now I knew I could use that survival to fuel a carefully measured response. I drew up a step-by-step plan. First, I would establish boundaries with my mother. No more unsolicited lessons about money, life choices, or failure. I would respond to any communication with calm, reasoned statements that reflected facts, not emotion. Second, I would document everything moving forward, keeping a record of any attempt to intimidate, belittle, or manipulate me. Third, I would prepare a public response, not one of anger, but one that clearly showed the absurdity of her actions while also protecting myself legally. I allowed myself to feel the anger fully. Sometimes I cried, screamed into pillows, even paced my apartment. It was cathartic, necessary, but I never let it cloud my judgment. Every step I took, every note I wrote, every plan I laid out was grounded in clarity. I was turning their weapons of guilt, humiliation, and judgment back on them, but on my own terms. I also started to think creatively. Maybe it wouldn't be literal financial revenge. Maybe it would be social, emotional, or symbolic. I wanted my mother and grandmother to see that their attempts to control me, to challenge me as a failure, had backfired spectacularly. I would take the narrative they tried to write and rewrite it completely, not with malice, but with proof of my resilience, intelligence, and self-worth. By the end of the week, I had a folder filled with decades of evidence, a network of friends and mentors ready to support me, and a plan that combined strategy, boundaries, and public exposure. I felt lighter, more in control than I had in years. The fire in me was no longer just anger. It was a tool, a weapon I could use intelligently. Sitting in my apartment that night, looking at the $347,000 bill lying innocently on my table, I whispered to myself, "You wanted to brand me a failure. Fine. I'm done failing. And you're about to see that clearly." It was the moment I realized that revenge doesn't have to be loud, reckless, or messy. It can be calculated, clever, and ultimately deeply satisfying. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had the upper hand. By the time I began to execute my plan, the anger that had been simmering for weeks had transformed into a sharper, clearer purpose. This wasn't about screaming or crying or indulging in rage. This was about strategy. For years, my mother and grandmother had defined me as a failure, and for years I had quietly endured it. Now it was my turn to take control. The first step was subtle but effective. I began sharing small public truths online about parental expectations, emotional manipulation, and the absurdity of measuring love in dollars. I didn't mention names at first. I wanted to focus on the behavior, not the drama. The posts were relatable, heartfelt, and honest. People started commenting, sharing similar experiences, and the story began to build momentum. I realized just how many people had felt the same shame, humiliation, and guilt my mother had tried to pin on me. Meanwhile, I continued to document everything. Every interaction, every attempt by my mother to manipulate or control me. I remained calm, composed, and meticulous. Every text, every email, every voicemail became evidence. And then I took the leap. I posted the story of the $347,000 invoice. I told it with humor, honesty, and a touch of disbelief, because let's be honest, it was unbelievable. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People were outraged, incredulous, and supportive. Messages poured in from strangers and friends alike, all with the same sentiment. No one should be treated like this, least of all by their own family. The reaction wasn't limited to social media. Even in my small circle of friends and colleagues, the story spread like wildfire. My mother, who had always reveled in controlling narratives, was suddenly exposed. Her attempts to justify the invoice, to brand it as a lesson, were met with ridicule and disbelief. Those who once nodded politely at her criticisms now shook their heads in disbelief, questioning the cruelty of such an act. Grandma felt the impact too. Suddenly, the person who once whispered her judgments behind closed doors was confronted with a new reality. She couldn't ignore it. The world saw her complicity. I could almost feel the discomfort radiating from her whenever she attended family gatherings after that. Her words, which once cut me so deeply, now hung in the air, powerless against the truth. Through it all, I remained composed. I didn't lash out, I didn't beg for validation, and I didn't stoop to cruelty. Instead, I let the facts, the stories, and the truth speak for themselves. Every post, every comment, every conversation reinforced one undeniable message. I was not a failure, and their attempts to define me had failed spectacularly. The most satisfying moment came the day my mother tried to confront me in person. She seemed flustered, unnerved, almost desperate. I listened calmly as she tried to justify her actions. Her words faltered under the weight of public opinion and the undeniable documentation I had gathered. I didn't need to raise my voice or fight back. The evidence, combined with my composure, did all the work for me. I watched as she realized her control over me had evaporated. I felt an emotion I had never experienced before. Years of criticism, humiliation, and manipulation had prepared me for this moment. I was no longer the scared, anxious girl desperately trying to meet impossible expectations. I felt strong, empowered, and unbreakable. Sitting alone that night, I looked at the $347,000 invoice one last time. I let out a genuine, triumphant laugh that had nothing to do with mockery and everything to do with liberation. That piece of paper, once a symbol of shame and control, was now just a relic, a reminder of how far I had come and how much power I had reclaimed. For the first time in my life, I felt free from judgment, free from manipulation, free from the toxic definitions that had haunted me for decades. And in that freedom, I understood something profound. Revenge isn't about hurting others. It's about reclaiming your power, rewriting your story, and proving to yourself that no one, not even your own family, can define your worth. I had won, and it was incredible. After my story went public and the $347,000 invoice became known among friends, family, and social media, the atmosphere in my life shifted completely. For weeks, I lived in a mix of exhilaration and tension. I had reclaimed my power, but that victory came with fallout I hadn't fully anticipated. The first reaction came from my mother. I noticed it instantly. Her calls dwindled, and when she did call, her voice lacked its usual arrogance. She tried a few times to manipulate me, making subtle jabs disguised as concern, but it was clear she was losing her grip. Every time she tried to justify herself, I remained calm, polite, and factual. No shouting, no pleading, just the truth and the confidence that came with it. And it worked. Her words, once sharp and piercing, now sounded hollow and desperate. The reaction from my grandmother was even more striking. She had always been the one to quietly enforce my mother's judgments. She was the one who whispered criticisms when she thought I wasn't listening. But once my story went viral, she was exposed. Family gatherings became awkward. She would look at me nervously, as if expecting judgment, only to realize it was her turn to feel the weight of accountability. I could see the shame etched on her face, the way her eyes darted around, looking for allies that weren't there. She had underestimated me for years, and now she was facing the undeniable reality. I was no longer a passive target. Extended family members began to contact me privately. Some offered support, expressing their disbelief at my mother's actions and admiration for how I handled everything. Others, loyal to my mother, criticized me, calling me ungrateful or disrespectful. It was a strange mix of validation and tension. I realized that taking a stand always comes with polarized reactions, and that was a lesson in itself. The most profound change, however, was internal. I had always carried the weight of their criticism, a constant pressure that dictated my choices, my emotions, and even my self-worth. But now that weight was gone. I felt lighter, freer, and more confident than ever before. Every step I took, every decision I made was guided by my own judgment, not theirs. I had finally reclaimed my narrative. Still, the fallout wasn't painless. The family bonds that once existed, however strained, were fractured. My mother was furious, my grandmother was ashamed, and my father remained silent. I felt a pang of sadness for the relationships I had wished for, the family unit I had craved, but I also understood that some connections are toxic beyond repair. Sometimes self-preservation means walking away. My friends and colleagues became my new support system, a chosen family that validated my experiences and encouraged my growth. Their belief in me reinforced the truth I had always struggled to see. My worth wasn't determined by my mother's judgments or my grandmother's whispers. It was intrinsic, and no one could take it away. I also noticed an interesting side effect. My own confidence inspired others. Friends began sharing their experiences with toxic parents, emboldened by my story. Strangers reached out to thank me for bringing something to light that had been hidden by shame. The power of reclaiming my story extended far beyond my own life. One evening, sitting in my apartment, I reflected on everything that had happened. The $347,000 invoice, the phone calls, the public exposure, it all felt surreal. I had stood up to those who tried to define me, exposed their cruelty, and emerged stronger. The fallout was intense, but I had survived, and more importantly, I thrived. I understood a vital truth. When done with measure and strategy, revenge is not about destroying others. It's about liberating yourself. My mother and grandmother may never fully understand the consequences of their actions, but that was no longer my concern. Their opinions were no longer a prison. I had built my freedom brick by brick, post by post, word by word. For the first time in my life, I could breathe without anxiety, without fear of judgment, and without the shadow of their expectations looming over me. It was more than just a battle. It was a fight for my life. And though some relationships were lost forever, the peace and empowerment I felt were worth every confrontation, every tear, and every sleepless night I endured. I had learned something invaluable. The consequences of standing up for yourself can be messy, painful, and unpredictable, but they are far better than living a life defined by someone else's cruelty. And as I looked ahead, I knew this was just the beginning of living life on my own terms, for myself and without apology. It took weeks, not months, to fully process everything that had happened. The $347,000 invoice, the calls with my mother, the crushing response from my grandmother. The public attention had been a whirlwind, a storm of emotions and revelations. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe without guilt, without shame, without the heavy burden of trying to prove my worth to people who would never see me as enough. I had rebuilt my life on my own terms. My apartment, once just a small functional space, had become my sanctuary. Every corner of it reminded me of my independence, my own choices, my own successes, my own sense of peace. I started spending more time with people who lifted me up, friends who celebrated my wins and supported me through my struggles. I realized how powerful it was to surround myself with those who valued my life without judgment. Financially, emotionally, and socially, I was thriving. I was working a job I loved, one I had fought hard for without anyone's approval. I was making decisions about my life without consulting the mother who had branded me a failure decades ago. I was learning to trust myself, to value my instincts, and to stop letting the past dictate my present. Even the reactions from my mother and grandmother no longer held the same power over me. They were distant echoes, reminders of the toxicity I had escaped. My mother's attempts to manipulate or criticize were met with calm, measured boundaries. I had learned to disengage, to protect myself from her hurtful words. My grandmother's occasional comments, once devastating, now barely grazed me. They were no longer chains, just echoes. One afternoon, sitting in my favorite coffee shop, I found myself reflecting on the journey. The absurdity of the $347,000 bill could have been humiliating, but instead, it became a turning point. I realized that what was once a source of shame was now my greatest lesson. It taught me to recognize manipulation, to value my worth, and to seize control of my narrative. I also understood something profound about revenge. True revenge isn't about humiliating or hurting someone else. It's about reclaiming your power and living fully. Every post, every boundary I set, every strategic move I made wasn't about hurting my mother or grandmother. It was about proving to myself that their definitions of failure were meaningless. The sweetest revenge was living my life unapologetically, with joy, and without fear of their judgment. I started volunteering at a local organization that helped young adults navigate toxic family relationships. Sharing my story and helping others see that they were not failures became a form of healing. Every time someone told me they felt empowered after hearing my experience, I felt a deeper sense of purpose. My pain, my anger, and my struggle were no longer just my own. They had become tools to help others reclaim their lives. There were moments of sadness, of course. I missed what I hoped my family could be. The love, the support, the validation. But I learned that those dreams, while beautiful, were not necessary for my happiness. I had created a new definition of family, one built on trust, affection, and mutual respect. One night, sitting in my apartment and looking out at the city skyline, I smiled. The $347,000 bill, once a symbol of shame and judgment, was now just a piece of paper, a relic of the past. I had transformed it into a symbol of my resilience. I had survived, I had fought back, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and freer than I ever imagined. I whispered to myself softly but firmly, I am not a failure. I never was, and I never will be. For the first time I believed it, and with that belief came peace. The journey was never just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, about turning pain into power, betrayal into clarity, and judgment into freedom. I had finally stepped out of the shadows of my mother's and grandmother's expectations and into my own light. And as I faced the future, I knew with certainty, Nothing, no invoice, no criticism, no toxic word could ever take away the life I had fought so hard to claim. I was free and it felt incredible. Comment. What I hope you take away from this is the profound power you have over your own narrative. No one, not a parent, a friend, or a stranger, gets to define your value. Setting boundaries isn't an act of aggression. It's a fundamental act of self-respect. We aren't responsible for the hurt others cause, but we are responsible for our own healing. That journey often begins with the quiet decision to stop accepting the way you're treated when you don't deserve it. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to protect your peace, even if it means changing a relationship. Remember that true strength isn't always about winning an argument. It's about having the wisdom to walk away from battles that only drain your spirit. You get to choose the people and the energy you allow in your life. Always choose yourself and handle your own heart with care. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.